Hi debaters, I'm Maggie Berthiaume, an instructor in the Spartan Scholars at Michigan State University, and this is a series of videos to introduce you to the 2020-2021 criminal justice reform topic. This video in particular discusses likely major negative topic-related arguments. It assumes you have some familiarity with the words in the resolution and categories of affirmatives already. So if you haven't watched the previous topic intro videos, the words in the resolution, and major categories of affirmatives, you should go do that now and then come back to this one. The final activity in the series will be a video and interactive timeline about the history of criminal justice reform. Note: this lecture is intended to teach debaters about the criminal justice system, including references to sentencing, policing, and disparate outcomes that arise in communities that do not hold racial and/or economic privilege. If you feel discomfort at any point, please stop watching or take a break. You will not be penalized in any way for doing so. The first area we'll look at is topicality. I discussed each of these arguments in more depth, including looking at evidence in the words in the resolution video, but to review, topicality enact versus court and executive acts argue that the word enact means Congress, so courts and executive acts are not enacting criminal justice reform. Topicality criminal justice reform versus abolition or bidirectional acts argues that the phrase criminal justice reform means a partial, but not complete, reduction in policing, sentencing, or use of forensic science techniques. That means that acts that entirely ban a practice are not topical, nor are those that increase one of the resolution categories rather than reducing it. Topicality sentencing versus legalization and prison reform acts argues that sentencing means the type or length of a punishment, rather than if something is legal or not, so legalization acts aren't topical. Or it argues that the type or length of a punishment doesn't include the conditions while a person is incarcerated, so acts that deal with prison conditions are not topical. Topicality policing versus other federal agency acts like abolish ICE argues that policing means actions by police, which doesn't include civil law enforcement like ICE or the TSA. Topicality forensic science. I'm not actually sure this is a topicality argument yet, because I haven't found any definitions of forensic science that would limit the topic. This is an area for further exploration as students begin researching. This section focused on topicality based in the words in the resolution, but of course there are a number of topicality and other arguments against non-traditional acts that we will also discuss in lab. A lot of good disadvantages on this topic will be app-specific, but there are a few categories of disads that are more generic or can be used in multiple areas. The first type of DA to investigate is 2020 elections DAs. Carly Watson and Bruce Nager created an introduction to the elections DA video. You should watch it for information about the presidential elections DA file and how to debate the elections DA. In addition, while most elections DAs will focus on the presidential election, there are also likely to be congressional elections DAs that concern the makeup of Congress and which party is in control of the House and Senate. Agenda politics DAs are disadvantages about issues being debated and enacted in Congress. These disadvantages argue that the passage of the plan either prevents a bill that is currently going to be passed, or causes a bill to get passed that wouldn't succeed otherwise. The DA impact is about the effect of that other bill. While agenda politics DAs are less popular in the fall of elections years, given that Congress spends much of their time campaigning rather than passing legislation, they tend to get more popular early in new presidential terms, especially if the president is in their first term. Look for these to become much more prevalent after November. Crime disadvantages argue that criminal justice reform increases crime because aggressive policing, harsh sentencing, and use of forensic science techniques are necessary to prevent it. A common argument is that the fear of an aggressive criminal justice system deters people from committing crimes. The impact to these DAs is often something like the economy. Backlash and militia DAs are somewhat related to crime DAs, but they argue that even if crime doesn't increase as a result of criminal justice reform, the public belief that it will increase causes either backlash in other areas or an increase in non-governmental attempts to enforce laws, like militias. For example, the negative might argue that a reduction in sentencing will cause an increase in policing, as police officers will be more aggressive with suspects if they know the punishment has been reduced. The negative might also argue that civilian militias are more dangerous than government police officers since they aren't trained at all. The impact of these DAs is generally a turns the case argument. Like disadvantages, many counterplans are going to be affirmative specific, but there are a couple of generic options to mention. The states or territories counterplan is a perennial on domestic debate topics. It argues that instead of having the USFG enact reforms, states and territories should be the actors of change. It's particularly relevant on this topic since about 90% of incarcerated people in the US are held in state and local prisons and jails rather than at the federal level. Ezra Sarins produced the pre-SDI states counterplan, and there are a number of cards in there that suggest that criminal justice reform can best happen at the state level. The net benefit to the state's counterplan is then a disadvantage that applies only to the federal level, like presidential elections or an agenda politics DA. The most likely AF responses will be to either choose areas that are only federal, like the FBI or Border Patrol, or to argue that there's a substantial solvency deficit to the state's counterplan that comes from federal criminal law. The local counterplan is somewhat of a subset of the state's counterplan, but a number of criminal justice reform advocates have recently argued that the best policies are created on the local level since they know more about the details of their community. The Minneapolis City Council's recent decision to disband the Minneapolis Police Department is an example of this type of lawmaking. Strategically, the locality's counterplan would have similar costs and benefits as the state's counterplan. While many critiques are common on multiple topics, there are several that are either criminal justice specific or have unique application to criminal justice AFs. I'll briefly review them here. The abolition critique argues that instead of reforming or modifying the criminal justice system, we need to get rid of it altogether. Many criminal justice advocates argue that modest reforms are not only not very helpful, they actively work against the goal of eliminating the societal harms of incarceration and policing by convincing legislators and other activists that their work is done. This is likely to be the most common critique that is unique to the criminal justice topic, since it is useful against nearly every topical AF. Anti-blackness critiques are common on many debate topics, especially domestic ones, but there are specific critiques of using the government for incarceration and policing reform, and the entire concept of so-called criminal justice itself from an anti-blackness perspective. These can be read on their own, or they can be combined with some of the arguments from the abolition critique. Gender critiques argue that criminal justice reformers ignore the way that gender intersects with policing and incarceration, particularly for non-men and people who are LGBTQ+. These arguments incorporate excluded perspectives to criticize reform, and like anti-blackness critiques, they can be read on their own or combined with abolition arguments. Capitalism and neoliberalism critiques criticize attempts at criminal justice reform from the perspective of anti-capitalism and economic inequality. They argue that criminal justice can't be reformed without first confronting the capitalist structures that created police to protect private property and made things like private prison systems. Security critiques generally criticize the way the affirmative frames their impact. An AF that has an economy impact to prison reform, for example, could easily be criticized from a security perspective that depicting a crisis scenario that identifies an existential risk. The negative will also argue that these scenarios create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fear of existential catastrophes causes policymakers to act in ways that others perceive as aggressive, so they respond in kind. When policymakers are motivated by fear, they also become willing to implement repressive policies in order to stave off anticipated crises, which may turn the case or cause worse criminal justice policies in other areas. The last major category of critiques is critique versus critique strategies against non-traditional affirmatives or other AFs that employ critique arguments in the 1AC. It's not possible to describe the details of these arguments in advance because they depend entirely on which critique arguments and authors that the 1AC uses. But in general, these tend to be highly effective strategies. We'll look at examples in lab as we develop and discuss affirmative critique arguments. This has been just a brief overview of likely negative arguments on the 2020-2021 criminal justice topic. Over the course of the season, debaters and coaches will certainly add other major arguments, but I hope this helps you think about the topic as you get started in your learning. Good luck this season.